Welcome, everyone. If we could grab a seat, we'll get started. Let me thank you all for coming back. Those of you that were here during the day, we had just some outstanding presentations. We are so fortunate to have such highly qualified speakers come and share their information, their knowledge, their experience with us. Let's just give them another round of applause as they... And if you would like to start filing up, we're going to have a panel discussion tonight. And let me also recognize Tom Segerstrom for the great job he did moderating today. So please bear with me, those that were here this morning. We have a few new people this evening. And I just want to mention again, the purpose of this forum is to simply share science-based information so that when there's a community conversation, that it's based on the latest CWD research and information. We are not presenting any plans or proposals tonight for any agencies. We're not taking any comments. So if you came here to make a comment about the pros and cons of feed grounds or wolf management or future game quotas, this is not the place to do that. So we would ask that we succinctly ask questions that focus on CWD so we can really maximize the time that we have with these talented and really experts in CWD. So the way this will work is the planning team has developed a number of questions that we will present to the panel. One question will come from the panel, then we'll have a discussion, and then the next question will come from the audience. And either someone can ask a question or we may select a written question that you all have already written down and put in the question basket. So we'll alternate one question from the audience, one question from the planning team. So at the end of the panel discussion, we'll have Dave Gustine from the Grand Teton National Park to do kind of a wrap-up. But first, I'd like to introduce this evening's moderator. Many of you know our own John Turner, who will be moderating. Many perhaps don't know how strong of a wildlife background, how diverse a background he has in wildlife, not only from being out in the wilds as a guide outfitter, but also as the first researcher to do research on bald eagles and golden eagles here in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And I'd like to say even though John is listed as former Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs, I like to describe John's pinnacle of his career as the director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, my former boss, a couple of decades ago, I guess. And under John's leadership, the refuge system added 55 new national wildlife refuges across the country. So did a great job, was a great director. Please help me welcome John Turner.
Steve, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here tonight. It's an honor for me to participate. I got a call a few minutes ago that said, Turner, where are you? And I said, well, I'm at the CWD forum. He said, how in the hell can you spend 12 hours on one wildlife issue? And those of us gathered here, and many across the region, know that this kind of issues compels us to give it that kind of attention and passion and complexity. It reminds me of an incident a few years ago. I was, and those of you interested in wildlife might appreciate, I was down in Laramie working with the University of Wyoming, working on molding a new school environment, natural resources. And it was early in the morning, dawn 30. We were at a restaurant with a UW president and Bill Ruckles' house, first administrator of EPA. We were working on the day's forum, and right next to our table there was a bunch of ranchers, and any of you from the West can picture this. These guys, sweatbands on their hat, and they're sitting there solving all the world's problems. You can tell they'd owned that table since statehood. Gathered every morning, and they were pointing and talking about me, and I kind of got puffed up about that. I thought, you know, yes, I was involved in listening to the spotted owl and the reintroduction of black-footed ferret in Wyoming, and putting the plan together for the reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone. But I had served in 2 administrations and served in the Wyoming State Senate, and so I got kind of swelled up that people recognized me, and that made me feel pretty good. Well, I walked up to pay my bill, and this old rancher followed me up, and he looked very happy chewing on a match. Paid my bill, turned around, and he says, hey, he said, anybody ever tell you look a lot like John Turner? He's poking me in the chest, and I kind of backed up and said, well, yeah. He says, I'll bet it makes you madder than hell, doesn't it? Okay, well, enough of that. Thank you all for being here. Thank the presenters. I want you to all look in the back of your program, look at our sponsors, the people that helped make this possible, and thanks all of you for participating. As Steve explained, this is our chance your chance to ask these wonderful panelists, and I want to thank you all again for coming to Jackson Hole early winter to share your expertise and your perception of CSD. We've got 3 sources of questions. You all, the CWD panel that put the forum together, and then the written bucket that we had outside. So when you ask a question, do it slowly, loudly, and distinctly, please. And again, as Steve mentioned, this is not a forum for any of us to give speeches and insights on our philosophy on management schemes and so forth. This is to examine the ramifications of CWD. So let me see if any of you have, over the break, have thought of a question. If so, we have a mic. Use the mic so we get it on the transcript recorded. Any questions? Yes, Liz. Get her a mic, please. We got that roving mic.
It's on the stand, right? Yeah. Oh, there we go.
Thanks very much. Thanks for everybody being here. I'm just curious, we didn't talk about climate change today, and I'm just curious, some thoughts from the panel on, one, how climate change may relate to CWD and how it may or may not limit our management opportunities or challenges that exist.
Thank you, Liz. Possible impact of climate change. Who'd like that one?
I don't see any big obvious climate change impacts in this part of the country because you're not at the southern range or the southern limit of the range of the elk, and I presume we're talking about elk. But there's probably some more complex things that people might feel.
So there's no temperature correlation with prion sustainability in the environment, or
Right, they're so resistant that the minor changes in temperature aren't going to degrade them further.
any other comments on?
Somebody has to have something.
Well, I do think that a warming climate is clearly going to favor population growth in elk. I mean, there's going to be winners and losers in climate change, and elk are going to be one of the winners. Summer drought certainly can affect forest supplies as they go into the winter, and Chad pointed out how important those can be. But overwinter survival has a whole lot to do with when green-up occurs and when the first severe winter comes. And of all of the data that there are on climate warming, earlier green-up affects on phenomena. Absolutely the clearest. And the influence of summer and fall forage has to do with accumulation of fat reserves, of course, and fat reserves become less important when winter is shorter and green comes earlier. So I don't see any direct effect of climate on the effect of CWD, but it certainly seems to me that over the long term, over the next few decades, we should very much expect, and there's good scientific publications on this, that some species are not going to do so well, others are going to do very well, and I think elk are in the very well category.
Other comments from the panel members? Here's a question from the CWD panel. Would any of you like to comment on what might be some of the social impacts from CWD? That is on human health, economics of the region, any cultural impacts of in Wyoming or specifically Northwest Wyoming. So the question has to do, what might be some of the social impacts of this disease?
Go for it.
I was just saying, during the break, I think we were actually kind of talking about this topic. In relation to when CWD arrives here, or if it arrives here in Jackson, we would expect to see potentially a decrease in hunter participation. And so in that way, chronic wasting disease just might influence how people partake in hunting and might reduce the overall participation.
So I guess it's hard to predict, long term, but if we do see population impacts associated with chronic wasting disease, and this may not just be locally but across our state, we also might be considering seeing a reduction in hunting opportunity, and so that certainly would be an impact not only to our hunting community but also actually to our wildlife management agencies.
Others?
I'll just comment on one aspect of my talk being on if you were to start modifying feed ground management and things that could happen if you eliminated a feed ground. You could have elk in everybody's yard in Jackson Hole almost overnight. You could have ranchers, I can't appreciate it firsthand, but you could have ranchers with problems that hit them overnight. And it's just one minor example of the things we're talking about today. We appreciate are very serious in this community on the historic management that's been in place, and making sure that the dialogue is in place before, during, and after any kind of management like that is key. And I just think about different places around where if something's in place for a while, and I can picture, like Estes Park, people are used to elk in their yards. It's just, that's okay. That's what, part of it. But you spring that on somebody overnight, that's not necessarily okay, and you've got to have systems in place for that.
You make a really good point about the Rocky Mountain situation, and people have become very, very accustomed to having elk in the community, in the town, in their backyards, and in the park. And that has become a huge piece of the economy as well. I mean, they have an entire fall festival based on bugling. And so not specifically or only due to CWD, but we're already seeing effects of animals moving further to the east during that important economic time where everybody's coming to see the elk rut. And I certainly don't have any numbers on visitation or anything like that, but people are very worried that CWD might have a negative effect on the bottom line as well, not just from hunting.
Anyone else?
I've got a question.
Chuck?
While we're on the subject of hunter issues, several of you guys dealt with research that dealt with hunter surveys. And I'm interested, since we've not dealt with the issues with deer or elk here, what's happening with those animals? Are those hunters taking them home and feeding their family? Are those animals being disposed of? At what point in time are the animals that are found to be CWD positive, are the hunters notified? How does that all work?
So at least in Wyoming, if we sample a hunter's animal, and that's certainly voluntary, then we provide those results to them online. If their animal does test positive, we actually will send them a letter that indicates that they test positive, and we give them permission to dispose of the edible meat in that case. And what I would say, what we certainly see is all scenarios. We have some people who are very concerned, and they will wait for their test results before they will look at even processing their animal. And if it's positive, they won't consume it. And we certainly have other people who don't seem to be concerned at all and will consume it either way. And we have some people who really, they don't even want to know. They don't want us to sample their animal because they don't really want to know. So, I mean, we see all those scenarios in Wyoming. I don't know if anyone can speak to other areas.
I mean, it's similar to Colorado. It's voluntary sample submission in Colorado at this point, and so the folks who don't want to know just don't turn in their sample. But you can't get your results online, and then if you do have a positive, I think they actually request for you to bring the meat to them for disposal, and not, just throw it away. But it's up to you to do that or not. It's up to the hunter to make that decision. But in Colorado, hunter returns have just gone down and down. So the number of people that have decided that they don't want to test, because even if they knew the answer, they'd eat it anyway. Most people just don't test.
A similar question. Obviously, a lot of those animals have been processed either at a meat processor or at home. Who of the panel is going to take on the next grant to see what happens when all the prions get into our gray water stream? Anybody?
I'll take it on. That's more in line with sorts of studies that I've done in the past. We have investigated beta prions in wastewater treatment plants, and find that they survive the processes that are conventionally used.
A related question that came out of the bucket outside. What solution should our county, here in Teton County, Solid Waste Disposal Department, be considering for CWD-infected carcasses, disposing them?
In the state of Wisconsin, we had initially incinerated animals, and that was done at a pet crematorium, so that was a very tedious process. It required deer to be cut up and pieces incinerated separately, and was quite expensive. The state purchased an alkaline digester, and that was operational for a while, and that seemed to be effective, although I'm not aware of whether there was actual testing for its efficacy at the scale that it was being applied. Maybe others can speak about that. Ultimately, the state decided, based in part on research done in my group, to landfill carcasses, placing a thick layer of soil, fine-grained clay-containing soil beneath the carcasses, and then making sure they were covered daily so that they weren't exposed to scavengers.
I know that was one that Paul Vogelheim, one of our commissioners, we have a disposal site now which they have to eliminate. And our garbage is being hauled interstate. And so to take carcasses and move them across state lines, incinerators are very expensive to buy and operate. Any other comments? Question from the right here.
How do you view the existing regulations within these states, Colorado, Wyoming, all the states affected by the CWC? Do you think they're adequate? And if they're not, what do you think needs to be changed and kind of legislated in order to stop the progress of the disease? Is this clear? Well, what would you change in order to make things better, make things safer, to control the spread of it?
I mean, I'll give a very simple answer to that, and it's easier now that I'm in the university to give the answer, but it just seems like movements, whether it's captive or wild cervids, if you look at the big picture of the continent right now, where we just keep seeing CWD end up in all these other places, we're tying those back to movements, and the single simplest thing I think we could do is try and stop moving cervids. But those who are on the front end of the testing on that can probably speak to that a lot, but I mean, we know there's some uncertainty there where you can have an animal that's going to develop positive symptoms that we can still miss in the testing. But yeah, if you look at where we were, I think 15 years ago and where we are today, the movements have led to a lot of the challenges we're seeing nationally.
Well, I think it's important to separate, there's sort of two methods of spread of CWD. There's natural, sort of the wave front of disease moving across the landscape aided by animal movement, and then there's human movement. And
So that's not.
absolutely, and legislation can only address one of those. Considering the location we're in and where the recent positive tests have come up, I don't know that legislation is going to help locally, but at the broader scale, it's certainly a good idea.
What about enforcement?
I don't know anything about that.
Enforcement of
Enforcement, for example, if you have a game farm which produces on a yearly basis a number of diseased animals, and no one's actually testing in Washington and making sure that these animals are not shipped all over the country, that falls under the enforcement.
right. So most of the, I think, to be able to ship animals interstate, the game farms have to be herd check certified by the USDA, and that means they have to have no CWD positive animals within the last 5 years in their property. And that's based on any animal that dies in their property has to be tested for CWD, and there's a 0% prevalence on that ranch based on those samples taken. So that is not 100% obviously, because it's just probably a fairly small number compared to the animals on the ranch. And there appears to be very little political will to prevent the interstate transfer of animals for probably a lot of reasons, but it's a fairly lucrative business for the people involved with those ranches. So, I mean, obviously, if it were up to me as a scientist, stopping interstate transport of animals would decrease the spread of CWD. I also wanted to make a comment on states banning the use of urine scent products for CWD. So it's fairly common for hunters to buy the scent, urine scent, and then use that in the process of hunting. and a number of states have banned the use of that urine. It seems to be a very easy step to make for states, and I think that's why they're doing it. But from the urine perspective, detection-wise, the levels are extremely low, and I'm not sure that's it's one strategy, but will that prevent the spread of CWD to your state and over the interstate transport? I don't think so. So I think it's one thing for agencies to do without addressing the real problem. So the producers of urine are really concerned about this, and they've had some conversations with our lab about doing some research. And they're the most CWD free, as they say. I have no personal experience with their operations, but it's an interesting interplay between the different parties involved right now in the captive cervid industry. So we'll see how.
A question from the steering committee. What role do predators and scavengers play in affecting the transmission and prevalence of CWD? The role of predators and scavengers.
Yesterday, until recently, the common wisdom on this was that predators and scavengers clean up the landscape by consuming infected carcasses. But there was a paper in PLOS One last week. I want to say it was out of Wisconsin, but I can't quite remember. But basically, what they did was they looked at the prions after being digested by coyotes, and did they remain infective? And they did.
Well,
yeah, right.
But I'd like to address that.
Okay, good. But the conclusion of that paper was that predators could spread these around. And now Nathan will set me straight.
So that's actually a paper out of some folks in Colorado. I think so. And they've shown both coyote and crow pass through. But I want to point out that paper really suggests that these animals are spreading CWD across the landscape, but they, and the test detection guys can talk about this, they don't quantify the amount of pass-through relative to the initial amount. Is that true? Yeah. So although some of it passed through, it can be detected in the pass-through, we still don't know if it was significantly decreased by the digestion process. And there have been some experimental tests similar to what Joel does, where they, or Joel talked about today, where you can set up rumen-like substance fluids and sort of simulate pass-through. But just because it passes through a coyote doesn't mean it hasn't been decreased by the coyote's digestive system. And I think that's one very important point that is not addressed in that work. And I'll stop there, I think.
Might, related to that, wolves here impact the density of elk by taking them out of a dispersed situation and forcing them into.
Be useful in some sense to show the negative impacts of this disease. Yeah. Do you want to say anything? You want to talk about your short term?
Yeah, I've developed, I don't know, at least a half a dozen, maybe 8 of these models that do forecasts for a variety of large mammals, lynx, elk, bison, mule deer. And my experience is if you fit these models to data, after 3 years, 4 years, anybody could guess as well. I mean, the uncertainty explodes so rapidly that, really, you just can't say anything beyond, I think the best I've ever done is 5 or 6 years. So it's just not, I just don't, I don't feel that beyond saying, well, if all of this is true, then this will be true, which that forecast beyond half a dozen years or so for large mammals are really credible.
Well,
I guess I was trying to sort of grapple with, on the short term, that modeling exercise leads us to sort of somehow believe, oh, well, this is not going to really have a big impact. The long-term modeling exercise leads us to believe this population is going to crash, potentially. So how do you balance, it's not really a problem in the short term, so we don't have to worry about it, versus, we actually have to deal with it. I mean, the frog in a boiling pot analogy.
Go ahead.
I just want to comment that, yes, I produced the long-term model, but actually in the short term, if we look at the short term of my model, it does not say that everything's going to be fine. Actually, the very short term of the model, we see some of the lowest population growth rates for that population. In the long term, even though we have a smaller population, those population growth rates actually stabilize. So in the short term, in our models, we don't paint a pretty picture actually for the mule deer population that I study. So just to clarify that part. Comment? Do you want to comment?
I think it depends on whether you want to be ignorant or misled. And there's a huge number of case studies of where purely deterministic models with making long-term forecasts have led to excessive confidence in decision makers and led to bad policy. And so I think it really is an important responsibility to be honest about uncertainty. Because frankly, I think it's a lot better to be ignorant than misled. Because then, if you're uncertain, people tend to be much more prudent in their decisions than if they put more confidence than they should in a result for which uncertainty is not clear.
In the back of the room there.
Hey Tom, to follow that up, do you think doing these long-term efforts are useful just to document that uncertainty, to demonstrate to people about what we're looking at and what we don't know?
When you say long-term efforts, you mean long-term data collection?
Modeling. These are used in lots of different venues, and I think there's some value in demonstrating what the uncertainty is.
Yeah, when I talk about uncertainty, I'm talking about statistical uncertainty where we make a real effort to say what do the data that we have in hand entitle us to say. And I'm not talking about uncertainty that's, let's try this scenario and this will happen and we'll try another scenario and that will happen. And I think there's some value in that. It's just it's in some ways a matter of taste. It's not what I feel really comfortable with in a decision-making sort of situation. Long-term investment in monitoring, in hard-won, muddy boots data, I think that's fantastic. And the data I use today, those were hard-won numbers, and they're extremely valuable. And so I completely support long-term efforts at gathering information, steady investment year after year. I think there's a real limit to how far we can credibly make predictions about the future. But it is a very deep topic about why that is. But basically, it has to do with the statement that all models are wrong. They're all simplifications. Every one of them is some sort of an abstraction of the way, and we leave important stuff out from the beginning. That's why it's a model. We're leaving things out. And the things that you leave out mean that it's very difficult to predict the future beyond a fairly limited horizon, I think.
Tom, let me ask you a question related out of the bucket. Had to do with your model. This question said, Dr. Wood, in her presentation, showed the Laramie Peak elk herd had been infected with CWD since 1988. Since then, the herd has grown from 2,500 to 10,000. The infection rate is about 6%. They seem to winter in very large herds up to 1,700. Based on this on-the-ground monitoring study, what evidence is there to justify your model showing a decrease in the Jacksonville elk herd?
So, so, I guess I'd say several things. First of all, I think it would be quite instructive to look at the uncertainty in the data for the Laramie Peaks herd and see what do we really know about what's going on with that population. What do we know about prevalence? What do we know about infection? I mean, we've got some monitoring data that have been presented as if there's no uncertainty with those data, and of course there is. So that's one response. And the other response is, if you looked at what my projection showed, you can't rule out the possibility that this population could increase when infected with CWD. Take a look at that graph, and part of we can't rule out the potential increase. Now, the median prediction was a decline, but I was very honest in showing that we're really uncertain about that. There's more than one outcome that what we know based on the data we have would allow us to make. And I have a hunch that you might conclude the same thing if you did that type of analysis with the Laramie Peaks data.
Back here we had a question. More.
Follow up on that.
Wait a minute, get the mic.
Follow up on this. In 1988, Dr. Wood, when that herd was first found with CWD in it, if you had done a computer projection model at that time, would you have predicted a 400% increase in 25 years?
I'm a vet. I don't do models, so no, I wouldn't have predicted that. I guess I don't know what to say other than, that was based on very small data at that time. I don't do any modeling. I don't know what we would have predicted or what someone who actually has modeling experience would have predicted. I would agree there's a lot of uncertainty in our data, and our data is not great. We get samples out of those herds every year, but it's still not a huge sample size that we're looking at. Our prevalence estimates are rough, and our population estimates are rough. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. I have no idea how that would have modeled in 1986 when we found that positive. Maybe you know.
Lori, that worked?
It is important to emphasize, though, that populations that have a pretty high prevalence averaged across the population, including males, can grow quite nicely, thank you, in the presence of CWD. So if prevalence in females is low enough, then the population will still grow, but it will grow at a lower rate than it would if the females were not infected with CWD. So there's nothing inconsistent with an elk population growing that has a low level of prevalence, particularly if you're talking about a low level of prevalence in the females. But a growing population really may not be what you want if 30 or 40% of the males are infected. I mean, that's not an unreasonable sort of, you could have that outcome where you have a positively growing population with a very large prevalence in the males. And I don't know whether that's desirable or not. That's really up to you to decide. But I wouldn't say that just because a population is growing means that we don't have a problem with CWD.
I would absolutely agree. We had a very, I hesitate to call it similar, but possibly moderately comparable situation in Wind Cave in South Dakota before we had transmission almost certainly from the game ranch that was just south of the park. We had a very rapidly growing population, and for a long time after CWD was in the population, that population continued to grow. But we have finally hit a point where we have a lot of animals dying from CWD now, and it's having a population effect there. So it to me depends on how quickly your environment and your animal-to-animal transmission reach that point where you have a high enough incidence, a high enough proportion of your population getting infected every year to have an effect on your survival rate, significant effect.
I guess another comment along those lines, again, you may not necessarily always see a population decline, like if you don't have prevalence high enough in your females, but you can see other impacts certainly from this disease in your herds, and especially if you have really high prevalence in males. As those males are getting older, they're succumbing to CWD, and you may see a change in your age class of the deer and elk that you're looking at, particularly the deer, because that's where we see that big sex difference. So you may start to see you're not getting big bucks anymore. And boy, that's what we really want to have on the landscape. So there are other things that we could see as an impact that aren't necessarily tied directly to the size of the population.
I'm just going to add one other thing in on this relative to mule deer. I don't know it for elk as well, but there's been some efforts to take all the mule deer survival data that's been collected over the West in time, and this isn't perfect, but if you take all that data, a general conclusion we kind of come to is that if your adult female survival is around 85%, you're doing pretty good. But if you start dropping below that, and certainly if you drop below 80%, you're going to have such a high recruitment and survival of fawns to balance that you're going to see a declining population. So that doesn't has anything to do with mechanism. It could be any number of factors, predation, weather, whatever. But that's another thing just to keep in mind, more of a simple concept. So some of those prevalence rates I saw you guys present today on those females, if they start getting too high and you start seeing those survival rates, so I could see a population growing just fine with some level of prevalence, but once you start tipping that on the female survival, you're going to start to see it go the other way, just based on the broad scale population dynamics we've done.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment about the scientific analysis on these topics. So there's been a couple of, a handful, or at least a couple cases where they say, well, CWD was there and the population grew. And I'm sure there's just as many situations where there was CWD there and the population didn't grow, or the CWD was there and the population declined. So taking one case and saying, well, it was fine there, it'll be fine here, is a very dangerous, assumption to make. And that's not the type of assumption you can make scientifically. You have to rigorously analyze the entire host of options available and then determine the most likely outcome. You can hope for the best, but that's, it's a cruel world out there. It doesn't always turn out the way you want.
Let me give you a question from our CWD steering group. What is this current state of the science? What is the state of the science on the factors that influence the contamination of habitat with CWD? We heard a little bit about that. Transmission. Factors, plant uptake, soil texture, density of animals, weather, duration of prion viability. I guess another way to ask that question, the state of the science, where are the gaps? Where the focus should be in this arena of transmission in the habitat? State of the science, or what we ought to still look at?
I can start on that. So, excuse me. I showed a slide showing the persistence of scrapie agent buried in soil out to 29 months. That's about all that is available right now. So we don't have anything specific about CWD agent. We don't have prion survival data generated using the more sensitive techniques that Davin highlighted. So that's one area where more research is needed. We need to understand how long the agent actually persists in the environment under various environmental conditions.
Other comments on areas for research in this area, habitat?
we've done quite a bit of work investigating the environmental contamination from saliva, urine, and feces now. So I just kind of wanted to rank those in order of potential infection for people concerned with excreted prions. Saliva seems to take the cake as the most infectious out of those. And in a real animal infection of CWD positive saliva, we're still talking about, for us to be even semi-confident that we can infect an animal with CWD positive saliva, we did 30 milliliters of saliva to inoculate a deer, and that's not a real, likely dose, or nowhere near a likely dose for animals in contact with one another. With urine, we're talking 10-fold to 100-fold more than that. So urine is less infectious than saliva, definitely. And actually, there was in our experimental hands that there was no symptomatic disease that we observed in deer from inoculating them with urine or feces. So those two seem to be significantly less than saliva. So the environmental contamination either has to build up over time in an area, or the animals have to be persistently exposed to very low levels, and those have to have some cumulative effect on the animal. So that's an area of research we're looking into to understand the contribution of these, likely in nature, these very small doses. So, for example, an experiment that we're planning on this next set of animals that we have is taking one dose and giving it to the animal, and then taking that same very close to infectious dose and spraying that into 10 doses and seeing if that is a more productive infection. So that gets at the question of why is CWD so infectious in nature? How can it possibly spread between these animals when we know that the levels in these excreted samples, I mean, we say, oh, there's excreting prions like crazy. That's a strong word. I mean, they're on the absolute edge of the most cutting edge detection mechanisms in the industry, in science. So saying that there's lots of prions shed is a very strong word. Over the course of an infection, yes, there's multiple infectious doses probably shed in the matter of weeks or months for each animal, but no animal is cumulatively exposed to all of that at once. So that's something we're really trying to work on and teasing out why is CWD so infectious. So.
Could you comment on the bag of prion that a dead animal would be?
Oh, right.
From a dose standpoint?
Yeah, so the other, in probably a potentially more likely source of very intense environmental contamination is a carcass that decomposes on its own without a massive predator spread or consumption. That particular ground would have so let me I did this kind of an extrapolation of what a gram of brain would be in urine. I live in Fort Collins, so we have the New Belgium Brewery there, and those huge 100-barrel fermenters that are 2 stories tall. So 1 gram of brain is equal to 2 of those full of urine. So the infectious, biochemistry, I like to do math. So saliva was about half of one of those or so, or 10-fold less. So the amount of prions in lymphoid tissues and in brain is off the charts higher than so 10 to the minus 7, so a million-fold dilute essentially, 1 million to 10 million-fold dilute compared to brain is what the excrete is.
So Davin talked about levels of prions in urine, feces, and saliva media that are being released into the environment as well as carcasses. I think there's also a need to understand where hotspots exist in the environment. There haven't been very many measurements of prions in naturally contaminated environments, and that's a need, I think, and something that my group is working a bit on, focusing on mineral licks. You also mentioned plants. Right now, the state of the science is demonstrating that, in principle, a plant can take up prions. The doses, the exposures are not realistic for environmental contamination. Even with these high doses, it still hasn't been demonstrated the plants can take up sufficient quantities to initiate disease by an oral route, so that still needs to be demonstrated as well, or examined as well.
Just a quick related question in writing. Is there any evidence that humans can enhance the spread of prions, either mud on tires, boots, or the distribution of agriculture crops?
Absolutely, when the agriculture crop is a servant. But I would say as far as like the basic, we're talking orders of magnitude lower when we're talking mud on our boots type level. I think the biggest way that a human does it is by moving animals.
Question, back in the room in the middle there. In the middle, right under the...
Well, I've
oh,
got
here,
one for
excuse
you.
me.
Kind of want to put everyone on the spot. I think everyone on the panel is done with their schooling, except for Nathan. So,
He's got to get by me.
if you were able to go back to when you were completing your undergrad and you had all that enthusiasm that hadn't yet been jaded and demoralized by years of professional and political work, would you choose to study chronic wasting disease? And if so, you somehow had all the cumulative knowledge that you have today, what would you spend the next 3 to 5 or 7 or 12 years studying, knowing what you know today?
I can start. I definitely would. He said, "Don't say Iliopra." So, I think I'm not alone in saying this, but people who study wildlife disease tend to be pretty passionate about it, and I doubt anyone would change their mind looking back. Though I could be wrong about that. Sometimes it can be a pretty frustrating topic, but I definitely wouldn't change it. And if I could go back and then do research for the next 10 years, I'd probably continue to study genotype susceptibility in relation to CWD.
Yeah, I concur with Amy. I definitely, CWD is a fascinating disease. It's so complex, as I think you've all realized through this forum. So it's fascinating. And I too, I wish I was a geneticist, because the genotype susceptibility stuff is completely fascinating, and it's something that we didn't expect to see such dramatic changes in genetic composition of my particular study population. So it's something that's really fascinating for myself.
So I don't have a very specific answer, but I'll give a general answer here quick, that I'm teaching. One of the classes I teach is Careers in Wildlife Biology. It's really a primer in wildlife biology. So we have 150 new incoming wildlife biology students come in, and we give the course, and I teach from a history of the wildlife profession from settlement in North America to the present. And we had our past challenges, but certainly when you're presenting some of the current challenges and looking forward, the trick is every one of our big significant challenges, there's a lot of pain and suffering that's going to be involved if you enter into that whatsoever. And so it's this balance of how do you tell new students coming in on that to, you want to give them the realities, but at the same time you don't want to so spoil their enthusiasm. But your question, it's interesting, because I just wrapped up that class with one presentation on the realities of everything we're facing, and then I came back with the final lecture Tuesday right before I drove down here, why you should be motivated to pursue it. And it's all about, and it's a reminder to me too, but it's all about when you take one step forward, you accomplish one piece in this broader set of the professionals you work with, you're making a difference or changing the world on that. But what you just asked is the whole charge I put to them is how do you find that one piece that you're given time and place in your career where you can make a difference to help the overall body move forward. But as someone standing up in front of that many younger people coming out, it is a little bit, they're all there because they love to hunt and fish, or they love to hike, they love to camp, and they're all just, I want to work with animals. And you guys all know that this profession deviates in a hurry from that. So how do you give them the reality but keep them motivated? That question gets to it.
In the back, in the middle there.
Do you think that if or when CWD moves into Jackson, that the antelope that have been staying in Jackson rather than migrating would increase the chances of CWD spreading between species?
No, I don't. I'm not worried about the pronghorn getting CWD. But Joel talked about that one too, didn't you? No, somebody asked about that earlier. We don't need to worry about the pronghorn. It's my stance.
I wrote that down in my notebook.
Shane on this side, then we'll go over to the other.
Anyway, so as a biochemist, I'm going to look at the antelope prion protein and determine whether or not, sequence compatibility-wise, how different it is from deer or elk. And then if it looks like there might be a chance, I think we're going to make the protein in the lab. And make the protein, no one's looked at it. Maybe that's something we'll look into. But I don't know why not. Why does the buffalo not get CWD prions or things like that? There's lots. There's obviously the species barrier, but biochemically, these species barriers aren't well defined. At the animal level, they are. So it's a question of can it happen or will it happen? Are very different. I'm in the can it happen world. So that's just my comment on that.
I have a question for Joel, and then the rest of the panel as well. I guess we heard quite a lot today, Joel, about how soils can play a big role in CWD transmission. And it brings up a question, should we know the soil situation on elk feed grounds? What types of things should we look for? You mentioned pH, I think, is another one that played a big role in transmission. And then I'd like to ask others on the panel, are there other things that we should be doing to prepare as much as possible?
So I indicated that pH was important in terms of the interaction of proteins, prions with soil particles. To the extent to which it's important for transmission, that hasn't been examined. So in terms of trying to discern where soil might play a larger role in transmission, it would be useful to know something about the properties of the soil across the region that you're interested in, particularly the amount of clay minerals. Organic matter might be worth knowing about, although my understanding is organic matter content is fairly low in the soils in this region of the country. And soil pH is something one can easily measure. So those are the things I would start with.
Given all those things, though, is it really going to change you can't do anything about what you have, and we already know that CWD is going to go whether you have clay or not. How will it change the ecology?
It might give you an idea of which locations in the environment transmission might be happening more, at least from the environment.
Can I follow up just a little bit on that? I'll be loud. I guess a question that comes to mind is if there's clay soils in a particular place, say on a feed ground, would it make sense to put another substrate on there like gravel or cobble or, are there any types of things that could be considered? A lot of the feed grounds, the state feed grounds are pretty small, they're only about 60 acres on average. So is there things like that we could consider to try and reduce likelihood of transmission?
Possibly, that might have some effect. I point out that it hasn't been established that feed grounds are a place where environmental transmission happens. We're assuming it is a place, given the congregation of animals at those locations. Altering the substrate such that there's lower likelihood of prions being available to animals would make sense.
If we can steer the conversation to chronic waste and disease management / control / eradication, there's several dichotomies that we talked about over the course of the day. We have the CWD haves and the CWD have-nots. Given that the haves, all the complexity that we talked about all day, if we talk about the CWD have-nots, this part of the country, the state that I'm in, where we don't recognize CWD, Chad, Mary, Jenny, can you design a diverse enough habitat structure to prevent CWD from coming here? Or is it strictly an animal population management thing, and what scope and what things would you think about doing?
I mean, what strikes me here is that if you have the feed grounds in place, and the traditional management in place when CWD arrives, or you get it in some initial elk, presumably you've increased the rate of transmission because of the amount of nose-to-nose contact at that point, where habitat and distribution management could give you the biggest bang for the buck, potentially, I would think, is maybe having those animals less concentrated when CWD arrives. But again, I understand it's not simple here, but I don't think on any of these situations, habitat management's not going to simply solve the issue, but it certainly could lessen the rates of transmission. The same thing, I don't think we've talked about it a lot, and someone else can chime in, but I remember when I was working for Colorado Parks and Wildlife, we made the decision to really up the intensity of buck harvest in northeast Colorado because of those high male prevalency rates. But this will get back to a little bit. So the way you manage habitat matters on those transmissions, but also, and the reason we did that was we knew those animals are migrating up to the Continental Divide, and if we don't put the hammer on that prevalence and try and reduce it, as Tom says, males aren't driving your population dynamics, but if they have such high prevalence rates, we had to change our entire approach, and that wasn't good for hunters. If you hunt the pooter, and all of a sudden the management agency one day tells you we're not managing for big bucks or mini bucks anymore, that's not so easy. The reason we did that, though, at least my recollection when I was there at the time, was that we needed to minimize the chance of that really getting over the divide and do some efforts there. But to me, that doesn't stop it. But that's the same thing habitat management can do, is by spreading those animals out more. And it doesn't happen overnight, but you can lessen those rates of transmission. And to me, that's what we can do.
And in the Park Service, our approach has been, because we are such small entity surrounded by much larger entities usually, is to attempt to have our management mirror that of what the state is doing. So having densities that are similar outside the park as inside the park, and not creating a situation where we're going to have that really intense draw into a park. Now, we preach that, but the reality is often different.
And I guess I would say, I don't know about designing a habitat management strategy so much, other than, learning from what other places have done and tried, and management attempts that have been tried, some maybe showing some promise to some degree, but none of them have been successful in stopping spread. And I guess unless we have some sort of new tool or new strategy that comes out that we can find is really effective, I'm not necessarily certain that we can stop spread. I guess the hope is to limit spread. And then when we look at chronic wasting disease management, the reality is we're looking at long-term management, and this is going to probably end up being one of the many things that we have to look at when we're managing populations. And I guess that's kind of what I see going forward with management, is it's a long-term commitment.
Question, the red cap. Steve.
Yeah, thank you, John. The question I get often in the community, and it's mostly community attendees here tonight, is could the agencies succinctly describe what they're doing to prolong or prevent the disease from hitting the Jackson elk herd, specifically the refuge? And then once it does could you succinctly and specifically, agency-wise, say what you're going to do? And the third question is, Dr. Henderson talked about we all talked about the durability of the Prion, and you talked about the suit you wear into the lab. I'm curious how you decontaminate that thing.
The suit gets incinerated.
At 1,000 degrees for 5 minutes?
Yeah, all of the waste from the lab. Well, actually, maybe it just gets high temperature autoclaved, and then I actually don't know. It goes in a bucket, and the undergrads take it away. So, I hope that answers your. What was the other part of the question? Management, not a clue. Yeah, not my department.
Succinctly. Okay, so the Park Service encourages natural ecosystems to operate within their natural range of variability. And we consider CWD a non-native disease process, regardless of where it originated from, because we'll never know where it originated from. But we know for sure that humans have assisted in its movement across its range. And so we attempt to create situations with our native ungulates, specifically deer and elk, moose, and we haven't even talked about caribou, but their prion gene is very, very similar, if not exactly the same, as other cervids. So more than likely, if it were ever to get up north, it would also affect caribou. So we attempt to have populations that are, we like predators. We like to have populations that are regulated by a full suite of a fully functioning ecosystem. So that's what we promote. Again, the reality is often quite different.
So at least from our agency, we are right now working on trying to figure out how to address chronic wasting disease, and we certainly are in the process right now. We have a chronic wasting disease management team. We are looking at all of the literature that's available. We're doing that research. And we're looking at how do we move forward to try and identify some management strategies, because there's just not a lot of information out there. And the reality is most of the management strategies that folks have tried, or even some of those that potentially show promise, are strategies that are quite potentially pretty publicly unpopular. So what we're looking at doing, and unfortunately this is a process we go through, we're a public agency. So our next step is reaching out to our public, to our collaborators, to our stakeholders, and starting those conversations about management and chronic waste and disease in our state, and looking forward to see what we can develop together to look at managing chronic wasting disease. And that is going to take some time for us to put together. So in the long term, I can't tell you what we're going to do, but we are committed to doing chronic wasting disease management, and our commission is very committed to doing chronic wasting disease management. So I'm sorry I don't have anything concrete, but we are really working pretty hard in that direction.
Maury, another question?
Yes. One thing that continually raises its head as far as possible management strategy is closing down the feed grounds, stopping feeding of elk, stopping in all of northwestern Wyoming. In your opinion, if we stopped feeding elk, what would be the reduction in the population of the elk by not feeding them? Say a harsh winter hits, how many elk would we lose without supplemental feed?
There's a report that I worked on for the refuge in developing the elk and bison management plan, 2002. It's gotten a bit out of date by now. There weren't the predators around then in the abundance that there are now, and the winters were a lot more severe then, I think, than they are now. But the gist of that report was that mortality in the absence of supplemental feeding was only great during severe winters like 1997. I've asked Eric to bring some of those copies. They're freely available, and it was a pretty hard effort, but quite a while ago, and so there has been work done on that. But my feeling is, gosh, if that's a really important question here right now. And as I said it earlier, I think the nub of the question is, what are the benefits of supplemental feeding relative to the risks of concentrating animals? And that's the $1 million question. And so I think it really behooves you to dig into what are the benefits of supplemental feeding and to the answer to your question can be obtained. By some manipulation of feeding at some locations, proper monitoring of survival and recruitment of animals that are fed and not fed, you could get at that answer really reliably. Right now, the work that I did a long time ago, I think, is not all that valuable, but I think guesses about it are not all that valuable either. And it is an answerable question. Absolutely, for sure, it's an answerable question. Using an approach very much like what Chad used, and got really reliable results. If you want to know the answer to that question, then it can be done. It's going to take an investment, but I think it's a worthwhile investment, because until you know that, I think it's going to be quite difficult. It's going to be just a bunch of people's opinions about what the risks of CWD are relative to the benefits of supplemental feeding.
Okay, we do have some empirical data on that one too, and history on that question. With that, unless somebody has a compelling question, let me thank. One more question? Mike? You bet.
Yes, thank you. In 1995, the USGS out of Madison, Wisconsin announced that they had identified a CWD antidote. What has happened with that?
I'm not sure if that was the vaccine that was received some attention. It was after.
It was a form of lichen that they proved in the lab.
So it was that lichen protease that she's talking about.
It worked in the lab.
So I was not involved with that work. To my knowledge, the work has not progressed beyond demonstration in the lab.
It was?
I don't believe that work has progressed beyond demonstrating its efficacy in the lab.
Haven't they tried? Haven't they tried, or is it just... are they trying to use it in the field?
I can't really, not to my knowledge, but I'm not involved with that work, so I can't really speak to that.
Thank you.
Maybe one more, and on a positive note.
Shane, one more.
I guess I'm wondering if there's any reason for hope out there. Some of what we saw today showed very, very slow rates of increase in CWD. And I guess if somebody figures out a way to reduce transmission by a bit, I know, Tom, you don't think much of modeling, but is there any hope that we can reduce transmission just a bit and see a slow decline?
I actually think that's a really good point. Is a lot of the work that Tom talked about, that was not my work, but a lot of the work that has been done on populations, the relative effect of CWD relative to habitat and harsh winters, all these other things, is oftentimes observed to be small enough that just a little tip can make a big difference. And you can have a growing population with CWD present, as Tom said earlier. But, there's so many other things that happen, and then you have these cases where populations really do suffer from CWD. and figuring out why some populations suffer and why some seem to thrive, that's the million-dollar question. I don't know the answer to that.
Shane, thanks for that last question, and thank you for bringing your photography, audio-visual skills and volunteering all day long, so that Steve and his cohorts can have the proceedings available for those of you interested. Thank you all for participating. This is for taking your time all day. I want you all to join me to thank especially the panel members who come long distances on winter roads, sharing your expertise and knowledge about an issue that's paramount interest to those of us in Northwest Wyoming, and at a time of year when people are getting ready for the Christmas season and have long winter roads to get home in, but so travel safely. But again, let's thank this panel for just thank you all for joining us in Jackson Hole. One more individual that they gave really a tough assignment, Dave Gustine, has been asked by the steering committee to come up and in just a few minutes give us a summary of what we heard today, and I think that's a pretty tough challenge. Dave is a chief biologist up at Grand Teton National Park. Dave joined us in August of last year. Now has this great park as his laboratory and research, but we welcome Dave to the community, his wife and 2 children. Dave comes from Alaska, where he was there for 12 years doing different work with USGS, working with brown bears and caribou. He got his PhD from the University of Alaska, focusing on nutritional ecology with muskox and caribou. And he also did work at the University of Oklahoma, Colorado State, and the University of British Columbia. So Dave, thanks for accepting a pretty tough assignment. We look forward to your summary of today's proceedings. Dave.
Well, and to take a note from John, I usually start these things with a joke, but there's really nothing funny being the last person standing here after a 12-hour forum, let alone the task of trying to summarize really a rich conversation, I think, in information and science today on chronic wasting disease in 8 minutes. And so I need to apologize to the speakers beforehand, because I'm going to distill your 45-minute presentations full of information and details and hard work into basically 3 to 4 bullet points for each of you. And so I apologize beforehand if I mangled and missed all the important information in your talks. So, and there's certain ways you can do this, and I kind of went the easy route. I'm going to go through each of the talks today and kind of highlight some of the things that I thought were important, that possibly reverberated throughout several talks of the day, and that were kind of reinforced in the panel discussion this evening. So first, hopefully the panel doesn't mind, I'll just call you by your first name, even though I don't know everybody. Mary came up from the state and informed us that the nature of chronic wasting disease poses several challenges to understanding and monitoring this disease. And despite what I think most people, other than her, would say is fairly intensive surveillance in Wyoming, there's still quite a bit of information we don't understand on dynamics of the disease, as well as the population implications. And this is kind of really prescient to the rest of the day, as we understood exactly what she was talking about. There are clearly distinct differences in chronic wasting disease dynamics in deer and elk herds that are positive for the disease. Differences could be due to density, biology, prion differences, behavior, management regimes, or a different time frame in the progression of the disease. There is a chronic wasting disease plan in place, but uncertainty abounds, and their management activities will have to be experimental and adaptive in nature. So Davin came up. We went from a large-scale surveillance program in the state of Wyoming down to the actual protein itself, which I greatly appreciated. The technology he described offered an approach that enables detection at previously undetectable levels. So this is obviously a pretty important breakthrough in detection and monitoring. We were also informed that resistant genotypes can delay the disease, but not stop replication or shedding of prions into the environment. Now, he presented some next generation technology that can perform sensitive assays on live animals, and we were told about his environmental sampling work of excreta, and that apparently has, and I think it's obvious, has great potential as an important monitoring tool. Next was Joel, who told us that the prion association with clay particles does indeed enhance oral disease transmission, and that naturally contaminated soils can transmit chronic wasting disease to susceptible individuals. And we're informed that plants can also act as reservoirs for prions, but this is, at least in principle, not necessarily documented. However, the story, as most of today, is complicated. Particle size, salinity, prion form, pH, to name a few, all play roles in infectivity as well as environmental persistence. Amy came up next to describe her modeling effort, and she gave us a nice introduction into that the variation in incubation times for the disease prior to clinical signs is due primarily to genotype. In a worst case modeling scenario, we learned that how elk are managed could affect prevalence of genotype resistant alleles and population persistence. In this case, it's a harvest regime. Now, also, selective pressure is causing changes in genotype frequencies. However, the rate of change does vary with certain factors. Malia was up next with a similar modeling effort in a very in-depth study of the South Concourse County mule deer herd. And as was noted elsewhere for elk, chronic wasting disease does decrease survival in female mule deer. And prion genotype does affect susceptibility of individuals to chronic wasting disease. Now, chronic wasting disease will affect population sizes and genotypic frequency in the remaining population. It also appears that chronic wasting disease positive animals are predisposed to predation and human harvest. Moving along to Jenny and Nathan, we learned about the Wind Cave and Rocky Mountain populations of elk, and we also learned that free-ranging elk can have higher infection rates than was previously expected. Now, chronic wasting disease can contribute to population declines, and this is primarily through a reduction in adult female survival. Now, there's a bias between chronic wasting disease and a cause of death, so this emphasizes surveillance methods. In particular, it's better to focus on dead bodies, roadkill, or possibly targeted surveillance through euthanasia of possibly affected animals. Nathan reintroduced us to use his words, maybe it's not exactly a quote, the wolf house cleaning hypothesis, and how a coursing predator could potentially influence infection rates and population level effects through predation of infected animals. Dr. Tom Hobbs, gave us an excellent review on mechanisms of population level effects, again, driven by the influence primarily to adult female survival. He did discuss some effects to recruitment, but they are less conclusive. He presented his data-driven model for the Jackson herd that suggests that in the absence of harvest, there is an infection threshold of adult females that will cause the population to decline. Alternatively, at the current rate of harvest, there is no level of infected females that is sustainable. He also suggested we need management actions that are effective and feasible, and states that managing spatial distribution does both. And finally, that the effects of chronic wasting disease on the Jackson herd will not have large effects in the near term. And as our discussion of the panel showed, long-term effects, however, are quite uncertain. Chad was last, and he kind of followed up on Tom, and although he doesn't recommend this, but as an alternative to artificial feeding, he presented reasons for winter feeding that are similar to the reasons why we implement habitat management. And so he gave us some alternatives through habitat manipulation that are available instead of artificial feeding. So he asked the questions that can habitats be manipulated in order to meet management objectives in the absence of feeding? So he gave us several interesting case studies to demonstrate this kind of effort. The first was the Uncompahgre work that demonstrated that habitat manipulations do indeed increase overwinter fawn survival. He also forced us to think beyond winter and acquainted us with elk nutritional ecology work in the Pacific Northwest and Montana. In particular, he described our increasing understanding of the importance of summer and fall diets to population productivity. And he finally offered an experimental template for possibly shifting away from winter feeding in the Jackson area. And with that, I'd like to thank again, I know we've done it a few times tonight, but it's worth doing, all the speakers and moderators today for really an enriching discussion on the science of chronic wasting disease. And I think given Steve's initial goal for the forum, and that is that we all have a common set of facts that we move forward with as this progresses in the area, I think the goal is accomplished. So you should, it's well done. So one more thing, to acknowledge all the hard work of all the people that were involved in this. If you are a member of a cooperating agency organization, could you do me a favor and stand up so we can see how many people were involved in this and putting this forum together? It's quite a few people.